Montana Territory, 1877, there was blood on the snow when they threw her from the wagon. Tessa Simms hit the frozen earth hard, arms curled around the tiny bundle against her chest. The wagon rattled off without a backward glance, wooden wheels grinding over the ice-packed trail, voices fading into the wind. She did not cry out. Her breath came in short, sharp clouds as she pressed her body around her newborn son. The baby, barely an hour old, gave a weak cry. "SHH," she whispered, kissing the top of his damp head. "I've got you, Mama's here." The sky was turning gold behind the firs, light bleeding through the clouds. She lay in the snow, unable to move, legs trembling from the birth. Her dress was soaked through, torn at the hem. Blood mixed with dirt beneath her. They had left her with nothing. No food, no water. Not even a blanket for the child. They had said she was a disgrace. That a girl who got herself in trouble had no place among decent folk. That the baby's cries would draw wolves. And then they slowed the wagon just long enough to shove her off. She had no idea where she was, somewhere north of Helena, too far from any road she knew. The wagon train was heading west toward Bitterroot. She had begged to stay with them, promised she would work harder, eat less. But the preacher's wife had narrowed her eyes and said, "You made your choice, girl." Now here she was, half dead in the snow with her son. She heard hooves before she saw him. A single rider coming from the trees, a tall figure on a dark brown horse. The man pulled the animal to a halt, scanning the snowbank. His coat was long and lined in shearling, dusted with frost. He had a rifle slung across his back and his hat was pulled low over his eyes. When he spotted her, he dismounted fast. "Ma'am," his voice was low, rough from the cold. "Are you hurt?" Tessa clutched the baby tighter, her voice cracked. "Please, my son." The man dropped to his knees beside her. He was young, mid-20s maybe. His face was wind-burned, jaw rough with a few days' growth. He pulled off his gloves, reached toward the baby with steady hands. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "Let me help. Is he breathing?" Tessa nodded, barely. "He's cold." The man looked around quickly, then shrugged out of his coat. He wrapped it around her and the child, lifting them both gently into his arms. She winced from the pain but did not protest. His warmth was immediate, solid. "My cabin's not far," he said. "You hang on, all right. You just hold that boy close." She faded in and out as he carried her, the sway of the horse beneath them rocking her in rhythm with her son's shallow breaths. The man kept one arm around her, the reins loose in his hand. She heard him whisper to the horse, words like "steady" and "almost there." When they reached the cabin, he kicked the door open and carried her straight to a cot near the hearth. The fire was low, but the place was warm. Made of solid pine with clean walls and a well-used stove, it smelled of wood smoke and horses. He laid her down carefully, then peeled away the wet fabric and wrapped her in a thick wool blanket. He worked fast, grabbing a kettle, starting water, checking the baby's breathing. His hands were rough but gentle. "Name's Yates O'Connor," he said quietly as he cleaned her forehead with a damp cloth. "I ranch a few miles south, came up here to check on the trap lines. Lucky I did." Tessa blinked up at him, lips cracked. "Tessa Simms, my." "His name is Hayden." Yates looked at the tiny boy, then back at her. "Hayden's a strong name." She nodded once, eyes fluttering closed. When she woke again, it was night. The cabin was warmer now. Hayden slept beside her, wrapped in one of Yates's shirts. A small fire crackled in the hearth. Yates sat across from her, his long legs stretched toward the flames, nursing a tin of coffee. "You've been out for hours," he said without looking up. "I got some broth in you, not much but enough to keep you steady." He drank a little milk I had, goat. "Hope that's all right." Tessa's throat tightened. "You should not have helped me." He looked over, then really looked. "Why the hell not? I was thrown out. From the wagon train, they said I shamed them." His eyes darkened. "For having a child that your husband's," she shook her head. "There was no husband, just a man who left." Yates leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "So they tossed you out in the snow with a newborn," she nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. He muttered something under his breath and stood, walked to the stove, poured her a cup of something warm. brought it to her carefully and helped her sit up enough to drink. "People like that," he said, voice low, "they do not know what real shame is." Tessa looked away. "I have nowhere to go." Yates crouched down, meeting her eyes. "You and that boy are staying here. As long as you need." She stared at him, stunned. You do not even know me." "No," he said, "but I know what it means to be left behind." He stood, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders, then checked on Hayden again. "You rest," he said gently. "We'll talk more in the morning." Tessa watched him as he moved around the cabin, stoking the fire, checking the windows. He was quiet, steady, not a single gesture was for show. He was not doing this to make her feel beholden. He was just kind. She curled around Hayden, heart aching with something unfamiliar. Hope. For the first time since she left home, she was not afraid to close her eyes. Morning came slow in the high country, light creeping across the floorboards long before the sun cleared the trees. Tessa stirred under the wool blanket, stiff from the cold that had settled in her bones. Hayden lay nestled against her, his tiny breath feathering warm against her neck. The cabin was quiet but for the low crackle of the fire and the rhythmic scrape of metal on wood. She turned her head and saw Yates by the table, sharpening a knife with steady strokes. He'd removed his coat, sleeves rolled to his forearms. His shirt was patched at the elbow, the fabric sun-faded and worn but clean. There was a calmness in the way he moved, a quiet purpose that made her feel unexpectedly safe. He noticed her watching and set the blade aside. "Brought in water this morning. Warmed some by the stove," he said. "You'll feel better once you wash up." Tessa sat up slowly, cradling Hayden, her muscles sore but holding. "I'll need to clean him too, he hasn't been changed since." Her voice faltered. She didn't want to think about the road or the cold or the women who had turned their backs. Yates nodded. "I've got soft cloths and there's goat milk soap. It's plain, but it won't sting." She looked around the cabin. There was no curtain, no screen, just one open room. Her cheeks flushed as she glanced down at her stained dress. He caught the hesitation. "I'll step out." "Take my time with the horse." She gave a small, grateful nod. After he'd gone, she cleaned herself and Hayden as best she could, the warm water easing the ache in her limbs. She scrubbed the blood from her thighs, from the soles of her feet. Then she wrapped Hayden in a dry shirt and laid him back on the cot, where he yawned and stretched like any newborn would, unaware of the world he'd been born into. Yates returned with a bundle under one arm. He set it down without a word and returned to the stove. Tessa opened it to find folded garments, a simple wool skirt, a homespun blouse, thick stockings, and beneath them, a cloth diaper rolled with care. "I stitched some things last winter," he said, not turning around. "Didn't know what I was making them for then. Thought maybe I'd trade 'em come spring." She ran her hand over the fabric, the seams neat and strong. "You sew?" He stirred something in a pot. "Mama taught me. Said a man ought to know how to mend what he wears." Tessa dressed slowly, the clothes warm and better fitting than anything she'd had in weeks. She watched as he ladled porridge into 2 bowls, then joined her by the hearth. "I should leave once I'm stronger," she said quietly, spoon in hand. "You've already done too much." Yates set his bowl down. "Where would you go?" "I don't know, maybe to Helena. I could find work there. With a baby on your hip. You'd be run out or taken advantage of before you got past the edge of town." She lowered her gaze. "I don't expect to be anyone's burden." He leaned back against the chair, gaze steady. "You're not." Tessa looked at him, unsure how to respond. No man had ever spoken to her like that, not the boy who'd left her behind, not the ones who'd called her a disgrace. "You don't know me," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "I know enough." He looked at Hayden then. "I know you didn't leave that boy behind when you had the chance. That tells me more than anything else could." The wind rattled the shutters once, and the silence that followed felt full instead of empty. Later, while Hayden slept, Tessa stood by the window, watching the snow fall in slow, drifting sheets. Yates was outside, splitting kindling. She watched the way he moved, each motion efficient, unhurried. He paused once to stretch his back, then glanced toward the window. Their eyes met for a brief moment before she looked away. She touched the pane, the glass cool beneath her fingers. For the first time, she let herself imagine what it might mean to stay not just until her legs healed, or the snow melted, but longer than that. She thought of the way Yates had wrapped Hayden in his shirt, how he'd turned his back to give her privacy, how he'd offered help without asking for anything in return. When he came back inside, shaking snow from his hat, she spoke before she could lose the courage. "Why did you help me?" He looked up, surprised by the question. Then he crossed the room, setting the kindling by the hearth. "Because I know what it is to be left to fend for yourself when you're not ready," he said. "My father died in the high winter when I was 16. I had 2 younger brothers and a mother who couldn't lift a sack of flour without coughing blood. Nobody came. We made it through, but barely." Tessa wrapped her arms around herself. "You think I'll make it through?" He met her eyes. "I think you already have." She felt her throat tighten again, but this time it had nothing to do with fear. She sat beside Hayden and gently touched his cheek. He stirred and made a soft sound, then settled again. Yates moved to the stove and began preparing supper. The air filled with the scent of beans and onion, quiet and warm. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside the little cabin something had shifted. It wasn't safety, not yet. But it was the start of it. 3 days passed, quiet and cold. The snow deepened outside, but the inside of the cabin held warmth that reached deeper than fire. Tessa spent most of her time near the hearth, Hayden resting against her chest as he nursed or slept. Her body was healing slowly, but the ache in her limbs had dulled to something manageable. She could stand without swaying now, walk from cot to table and back again. Yates had not asked her to explain anything further. He rose early, tended the animals, brought in wood, and always made sure there was something warm on the stove. He spoke when needed and listened when she did. He never offered pity, which, in its own way, was the kindest thing he could give her. Late on the 4th morning, she watched him through the doorway as he worked near the lean to where he kept his tools. The light was thin, filtering through pine, and his breath fogged the air as he sawed through a thick branch. He moved with quiet rhythm, not in a hurry, but with no wasted motion either. She shifted Hayden to her other shoulder and pressed her cheek to his soft hair. When Yates returned an hour later, he carried a narrow board under one arm and a small pouch of nails in the other. "What's that for?" she asked, brushing ash from her skirt. He set the board on the table and pulled a hammer from the shelf. "A cradle." "Thought maybe your arms could use a rest." She blinked, startled. "You're building it," he shrugged, setting the wood flat. "Ought to do more than just say a thing." "Cradle's not much, but it'll keep him close to the fire when you need both hands." Tessa sat slowly, Hayden still nestled in the sling she'd made from Yates's old shirt. "I can help." He didn't look up as he measured and marked the wood. "You've done enough for now. Rest while I've got the chance to be useful." Her eyes lingered on his hands as he worked, broad, calloused, and careful. She didn't speak again for a long while, afraid that if she did, the quiet comfort of the moment would scatter like smoke. That afternoon, she ventured outside for the first time since the day he'd found her. The air was sharp, but the sun had warmed the snow to a soft crust. She walked only as far as the woodpile, watching Yates mend a section of fence with his sleeves rolled and a strip of leather between his teeth to hold the nails. She didn't call to him, just stood there, Hayden asleep against her, and let herself breathe. Later, back inside, she found a bundle of dried lavender tucked beside her pillow. She hadn't seen it before, must have been placed there while she stepped out. The scent was faint but sweet. She didn't mention it aloud, but her hand lingered on the bundle longer than necessary. That evening, as the firelight flickered against the walls, she spoke without meaning to. "My mother died in childbirth. My little sister didn't make it either." Yates, seated near the hearth with his boots off and a mug in his hands, looked up slowly. He didn't interrupt. "I was 12. My father blamed me, said I should have done something, but I didn't know how to stop a woman from bleeding to death." He set his mug down. "You were a child." He didn't see it that way. Her voice was even, but her fingers curled tightly around the edge of her skirt. "He left not long after." Went to Idaho to mine silver. I heard he died in a cave-in. Yates leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Is that when you joined the Wagon train? She nodded once. I thought I'd find something better out west. I didn't expect kindness, but I didn't think they'd. She stopped herself. The sentence didn't need finishing. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small carved figure. A horse, no larger than her palm, smoothed by time and handling. He held it out. My brother carved it before he left for Miles City last spring. Said he'd come back before the snows. He paused. He didn't. Tessa turned the figure over in her hand. The lines were rough, but the shape was unmistakable. I keep it close when I can't sleep, he said. Not because I think it brings him back. Just because it reminds me that someone loved me once. She looked up at him, and something inside her shifted, not all at once, but like water loosening ice. She set the figure down gently and covered it with her hand. I never expected to feel safe again, she said. Not really. Yates didn't move closer. Just watched her with that same stillness he always carried, like he knew patience was more useful than persuasion. You don't owe me anything for being here, he said after a long moment. But if staying feels better than leaving, I'd be glad for the company. Tessa glanced down at Hayden, then out the window, where snow still hung in the branches like lace. I don't know what I can offer. Yates stood, stretching his arms above his head. Well, you've got a boy who needs feeding and a way of making this place quieter than it's been in years. That's plenty. She watched him as he banked the fire, his movements slower now, like the day had worn him down. When he passed her on the way to his cot, she reached out and touched his hand. Thank you, she said. He didn't say anything back, but his fingers curled gently around hers for a breath before he let go. That night, with Hayden curled close in the cradle half built by the hearth, Tessa lay awake long after the fire dimmed, listening to the wind press against the cabin walls. She didn't feel alone. She didn't feel ashamed. And for the first time in a long while, she felt as though something good might be beginning. The cradle stood finished by the fifth morning, pine sanded smooth beneath Yates's palm. He'd carved a small star into the curve of the headboard, nothing fancy, just enough to catch the light when the fire flickered. Tessa ran her fingers over it, her thumb tracing the lines, and said nothing, but her eyes told him what it meant. That afternoon, the sky cleared. The snow had stopped in the night, and the mountains stretched sharp and blue beyond the tree line. Tessa wrapped Hayden in the quilt Yates had laid out and stepped outside with him. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. He found her by the fence, standing still as the wind moved her skirt. Hayden was pressed to her chest, quiet, his tiny mouth slack with sleep. I've never seen country like this, she said when Yates joined her. Back east, everything's crowded in towns, people, trees. Here it feels like the land's breathing on its own. Sometimes it feels too big, he said. But not today, she turned to him. You ever think about leaving it? I did. Once. He leaned against the fence rail. Right after my brother left. Thought maybe I'd ride south, try my hand at cattle down near the Yellowstone. What stopped you? He watched a hawk circle high above the pines before answering. Didn't feel right going where nobody needed me. Tessa adjusted Hayden in her arms. And now, his eyes settled on her, steady and quiet. Now I've got reason enough to stay put. Neither of them said more. They didn't need to. She let the silence stretch between them, easy now, not heavy. Inside, she set Hayden in the cradle and watched him sleep with his fists curled beneath his chin. Yates stood beside her, arms folded. His shoulder brushed hers and he didn't pull away. He looks better, he said. He's stronger, she said. Because of this place. You did the hard part. She looked up at him, eyes sharp. No, I did not alone. That evening, she peeled potatoes while Yates cleaned his saddle by the door. It was the first time she'd reached for the knife without being asked. Her hands moved with care, the skins piling soft on the table beside her. What happens when spring comes? She asked. Yates didn't look up. Well, I'll ride into town for supplies, sell off what I can't keep through summer, she nodded slowly. I could sew or mend. Or take in laundry from the nearest ranches. He set the saddle aside, wiping his hands. "You thinking of staying?" Tessa didn't answer right away. She picked up another potato, began slicing slowly. "I've been thinking there's no such thing as earning a place, not in the way folks mean it. You either get taken in or you don't." Yates straightened. "You're taken in." Her hands stilled. "You don't have to do anything more," he said. "You're wanted here." Her breath caught, but she didn't let it show. She looked down at her work, then folded her hands in her lap. "Then I'd like to stay." Later, when the stew was simmering and the windows had fogged from the heat of the hearth, she folded a clean cloth and laid it over Hayden's cradle. Her movements were steady, sure. Yates watched from the table, a light in his eyes he hadn't carried in months. "You always this quiet?" she asked. "No, just not used to having someone worth talking to." She smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't say much either, but I listen." "I've noticed." She touched the cradle's edge, then turned toward him. "I want to build something here, not just get by, make a life, not just survive one." Yates stood slowly, the chair scraping the floor. He crossed to her, not rushed, not unsure. He took her hand carefully, like she was made of something that mattered. "I'd like that," he said. "With you?" Tessa looked up at him, her fingers tightening around his. There was no fear in her eyes now, only something quiet and fierce. She leaned into him then, their foreheads touching for a single, steady moment. No promises, no declarations, just breathe shared and hands held. The fire snapped once, and the cradle rocked gently as Hayden stirred. Outside, the snow began to melt in slow rivulets, dripping from branch and beam. And inside, two people who had been discarded by the world without ceremony began to shape something lasting together. By early March, the snow had thinned to patches, and the thaw brought mud and birdsong. The cabin roof dripped steadily, and the logs darkened with moisture as winter loosened its hold. Tessa had taken to airing the bedding in the mornings, hanging it over the porch rail where the weak sun could warm it. Hayden was growing steadier in her arms, his limbs stretching longer, his eyes tracking movement with quiet alertness. Yates had fixed the hinge on the shed and built a second goat pen. He didn't say why, but Tessa saw him glancing toward the line of pines more and more, as though something waited out there worth preparing for. One morning, he came in with a letter, the paper browned and creased from travel. "Trapper dropped this off on his way through," he said, handing it to her with a cloth-wrapped loaf he'd traded for. Tessa dried her hands, took the letter, and read it by the hearth while Hayden napped in the cradle. Her brow furrowed as she scanned the lines, then folded it slowly. "My cousin Ruth sent word. She's in Missoula now, working at a boarding house, says she heard I might have died." Yates set the kettle down. "You want to send word back," she nodded. "I'll write to her, let her know I'm safe. Maybe someday she'll come visit." They didn't speak more of it, but later that evening, she set pen to paper and wrote carefully, her words plain and true. She ended it with a line about the mountains, and how they felt like a place she could root into. That night, while Hayden lay sleeping, she sat beside Yates with her hands still ink-stained. The fire cast a low glow across the floor and the kettle hissed softly. "You ever think about marrying?" she asked, voice low. Yates didn't look surprised, only thoughtful. "I used to think if I did, it'd be someone who knew the land, someone quiet, strong without saying it, never thought much past that." Tessa drew her knees up beneath her skirt. "I never thought I'd get to ask someone or be asked." He turned to face her fully. "Would you want to be?" Her lips parted, then closed again. She looked toward the cradle. "I would, but not for protection, not because I need someone," he nodded once. "Because you want someone." She met his gaze. "Yes." He rose slowly, crossed to the table, and opened the small drawer beneath it. From inside, he took a narrow band of braided horsehair, fastened with a silver loop. He returned and knelt before her, the firelight catching the edge of his jaw. "My brother made this before he left. Told me to give it to someone if I ever found a reason to stay put," he said. "I've found my reason." Tessa didn't answer with words. She reached out, took the band, and slipped it onto her finger. Her breath shook just once, and then her mouth found his, soft and certain. They married in early April when the creek thawed and the grass began pushing up through the deadfall. The parson from Elk Ridge came up on horseback, carrying a Bible and a tin of coffee. He shook Yates's hand and winked at Tessa, then stood beneath the budding birch while they spoke their vows with Hayden cradled between them. Yates said, "I will," and meant it with every line of his body. Tessa said, "I do," and her voice did not waver. Afterward, they shared bread and stew, and the parson left before dark. The sun dipped low behind the trees, and Yates pulled a blanket around her shoulders as they stood outside, watching the light catch on the creek. "I never thought peace would feel like this," she said. He kissed the top of her head. "It's not peace unless it's shared." They built a life slowly, without hurry. Tessa took in mending from neighbors who passed through and in time taught a handful of children to read when the families came north for grazing. Yates raised goats and traded hides. Hayden grew strong-legged and bright-eyed, always with a pine needle or rock in his hand, always chasing after whatever moved. By the second spring, the land around the cabin bore neat rows of herbs and root vegetables. Tessa kept lavender near the windows, and Yates carved toys for Hayden with the same steady hands he once used to shape fence rails. They didn't speak often of what came before. There was no need. It lived in the quiet way they touched, in the unspoken knowledge that both had been broken once, and had chosen to rebuild not alone but together. On warm evenings, they sat on the porch with Hayden asleep inside, their hands linked between them. Sometimes they talked about the years to come, of maybe building a second room, maybe taking in a child who needed a place. Sometimes they said nothing at all, but always, when the stars came out and the wind moved through the trees, Tessa would lean her head on Yates's shoulder and close her eyes. And Yates, with his arm around her and his heart full, would hold her there until the last light faded. They grew into their love like trees bending towards sun slow, rooted deep and sure beyond all doubt. And in that quiet place beneath the mountains, they never had to be alone again.